Weigel continues, despite the high-sounding words, one would have to go back to the Dred Scott decision to find a judicial pronouncement more ominous in its implications for American democracy. And Weigel continues, and I quote, "The American experiment is no longer about working out the public implications of what Jefferson called self-evident truths. No," says Weigel, "the goal of the American experiment is the satisfaction of the unencumbered, autonomous, self-constituting, imperial self." End of quote. The tradition I suggested inspired this university, and which it, in turn, vows to uphold and communicate, is a vast reservoir of such truths. Truths of the sort reflected in the Declaration of Independence, which come before the law and always remain above it. It is to me a great tragedy that in our laws over the last 25 years, we have witnessed not just occasional deviations from that tradition, but a wholesale rejection of its very premise. As a nation, we're just now, it seems to me, waking up to the awful consequences of false promises of liberation held out by such fashionable causes as abortion on demand and no-fault divorce. Harvard law professor Mary Ann Glendon has effectively traced the radical nature of our social experiments in these areas, experiments that have placed us on the radical fringe of Western society. Scholars like Lenore Weitzman and Judith Wallerstein have traced the economic and psychological trauma that divorce has brought to women, to children, and to families. The feminization of poverty, juvenile crime, teenage suicide. These and a host of other evils are directly related to the breakdown of the family. Nowhere is the governing premise behind the false promises of liberation so grandiloquently expressed as in the plurality opinion in the Casey decision. That premise is the view of the human person as a radically autonomous self, creating its own world and its own truths, irrespective of society and of other human beings. I think it's quite easy to see that no view could be more corrosive of that indispensable institution which is the building block of all civil society, the family. We're finally waking up to the truth. And the truth, by the way, is very expensive. It's expensive to the people of this country. As a governor, I see that expense in every line of our human services budget. We're called upon to make up for the fallout from the disintegration of these institutions. It's not just wrong, it's very expensive. Very expensive. And we've got to change it. We are not autonomous selves with the freedom to create the kind of world we want for ourselves without respect to its implications for the rest of society. We're members of a complex human society, large and small, public and private, in which decisions of one person affect all the others, in which responsibilities once accepted cannot be casually terminated. And the thread that runs through both of these phenomena, no-fault divorce and abortion on demand, share a common definition. It's essentially an evasion of responsibility. And therein lies a big part of the problem, it seems to me. You know, in retrospect, it's obvious that if a society wanted to forget these obvious truths, it would be necessary to deny the binding forces of the bonds of marriage and of parenthood, and consequently necessary to have no-fault divorce and abortion, which strike so directly and lethally at those most crucial human bonds. There was a novelist by the name of Pat Conroy, speaking of the collapse of his own marriage, and he observed, and I quote, "Each divorce is the death of a small civilization." End of quote. When we talk about the breakdown of society, we've got to direct our attention first to the breakdown of the most basic human society. For what is more emblematic of the decline of the family than the breaking of solemn vows when one spouse casts aside another, or when a parent ends the life of a child in the womb? This indeed is family breakdown, the collapse of a small civilization, if you will, with a vengeance. In the wake of the Planned Parenthood decision, we find ourselves beset by confusion about the most fundamental question that any society can ask itself. Who is a person, and who shall be recognized and protected as a member of the human family? Today in this country, in this great country of America, that question has no clear answer. Consider two recent cases. In Florida, a woman is charged with murder for ending her pregnancy by shooting herself. She went down to the abortion clinic, and it was a late-term abortion. The clinic demanded so much money she couldn't afford to pay it, so she shot herself, and the child died as a result. She was charged with murder. Earlier this year in California, in a 6-1 decision, the Supreme Court of California held that a person can be convicted of homicide. Now listen to this. Homicide for causing the death of an unborn child that could have been legally aborted. Supreme Court of California almost unanimously made that decision. The majority opinion stated, and I quote, "The third-party killing of a fetus with malice aforethought is murder, as long as the state can show that the fetus has progressed beyond the embryonic stage of 7 to 8 weeks." End of quote. Not even viability. I mean, Roe was viability. The court in California said that where the death is procured by a third party, feloniously, someone not operating under the privilege of the so-called privacy right in Roe versus Wade, that person can be convicted of homicide. So the law is schizophrenic, isn't it? When those very acts, if performed under the aegis of the privacy right, would have been transformed into a constitutional right. Now, only lawyers would understand those distinctions. I mean, if you explained that to a child in the 5th grade, the child would say, wait, there's something wrong here. Run that past me one more time. What's going on here? What's happened to our country? We've outsmarted ourselves. We're so politically correct and so sophisticated and so up to date that method of expression that George Orwell talked about in the novel 1984 is here.